So, what might surprise a lot of you guys by looking at me is that I've suffered with alcoholism and drug addiction for 25 years of my life, up until about 3 years ago. And, I truly believe that if it weren't for the actions of the guy that I'm going to talk about tonight and for his life and what it became, I would still be struggling today, and I wouldn't have the opportunity to stand here earning college level credit talking to you. So I'm going to tell you all tonight about a guy named Bill Wilson. And I intend to do that by saying a little bit about his early life, what that looked like, followed by his progression into recovery and hopelessness. Into alcoholism and hopelessness, his eventual recovery, and what he did after that, as far as it relates to his being the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. So Bill was born in New England, here in the United States. He was born in New Hampshire. He was a pretty headstrong kid. He always was able to, he was able to set his mind to some things, and he was always pretty much able to accomplish whatever he set his mind to. One summer he actually spent the entire summer learning how to carve a wooden boomerang that he had seen in a National Geographic magazine, and he carved a functional boomerang. He was also at one point decided he wanted to play the violin in college, early college, and so within a year he was the first chair violin player in his college. So he had this ability that once, a determination and a willpower in all other areas of his life, which would kind of haunt him later when it came down to accepting the fact that he wasn't able to conquer this disease that he suffered from, of alcoholism. So he went off to fight in World War I. He was an officer. He had I believe he led a company of men there in World War I, and he fought valiantly and bravely. He had received certain awards and things like that, and he's quoted in his story of saying when he got back to the United States that he was going to be successful. He was going to prove to the world that he was important. Had not the men of my battery given me a special token of appreciation, he intended to apply to, just as he always had done, all the problems in his life, this particular kind of willpower and motivation and determination that had gotten him so far at this point in his life. So he came home and he went to law school. In law school, he actually failed out. He had begun drinking during the war as a means to enhance the good times, right? And that had gotten progressively worse. It's the beginning of this long progression that most alcoholics go through in their life. And so by the time he came back to the United States and was in law school, he was out partying so much that he began to lose control of certain, the manageability of his life began to slip. And so he was unable to finish law school because he couldn't make it to certain exams and things from being up partying and drinking the night before. And so Bill dropped out of law school and made up his mind in knowing some guys that were in the stock market. And he came up with this idea that most people lose money in the stock market through an ignorance of stocks. And so what he started to do was go out across the country in the Northeast and a little farther out, and he would investigate these companies that were trading on the stock exchange, and he would find out things like if they had a new factory that was about to be built, or if they were about to sell the company. And he would go out and get information in a day and an age when information wasn't as available as today. This speculation of sorts that Bill was doing was very valuable. So he made a lot of money for other men and for himself in the stock market this way. And it was the great boom of the early 20s. It was seething and swelling, man. People were making a lot of money. And so Bill basically had gotten to a point in his life where he figured he had arrived, and he began to kind of live a life of affluence and leisure. There's a line in his story where he talks about, I acquired the impeccable coat of tan one finds upon the well-to-do. He spent his entire day. It allowed him to drink all day. He spent a lot of time on the golf course and hobnobbing with elites and in speakeasies and things like that during Prohibition. And all of a sudden, the stock market crashes in 1929, right? Or 39. Anyway, the stock market crashed, and people started losing a lot of money, including Bill. And a lot of his friends and people that he was acquainted with and business cohorts, a lot of them they were ruined. They had lost millions of dollars in a very short time, and Bill had made up his mind that I wasn't going to beat him, and he was just, rather than jumping from the towers of high finance, so to speak, he decided to go off to the bar and have a few drinks, and that old fierce determination came back, and he just knew he'd be all right. Well, that wasn't the case, and Bill's drinking had progressed so that he was unable to hold down a job. He began to, what little money he was taking in, he was having to spend to keep himself in alcohol, to keep the shakes at bay and things like that, and Bill was losing control, and there was some nasty scenes in his apartment with his wife, and he even began to steal out of her purse when she wasn't around, and he was unemployable. And so realizing that his plight was starting to weigh heavily on him, he He checked himself into Towns Hospital in New York under a Dr. William Silkworth, who was a nationally renowned specialist in the treatment of alcoholism and addiction at the time. And what this doctor told Bill was essentially that he was hopeless. He said that not only he offered Bill an idea that was new at the time, which is pretty widely accepted today, and that is the fact that not only is an alcoholic different in his reaction, or what Dr. Silkworth told Bill was, hey, your body's different, right? He came to this idea that we were bodily and mentally different from our fellows, that there's this thing that happens in an alcoholic's body, this reaction that occurs, this allergic reaction, if you will, that causes an alcoholic to continue to drink. It's known as the phenomenon of craving, and it only happens in a real alcoholic. And so this being the case, it kind of left Bill hopeless. And basically the doctor told his wife on his third treatment that, he was either going to die in DTs from a heart attack or stop breathing if he tried to stop drinking, or we're going to have to lock him away. He's got to be medically treated, but every time he would get out of treatment, he would go back to the alcohol. So he would have to be locked away permanently, is what the solution was for a lot of people in that time. And so after having left treatment that third time and knowing he was pretty hopeless, one night he's sitting around his house and he was visited by an old schoolmate. His name was Ebby Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher had been a drunk, and he'd been trouble for years, in trouble. Couldn't seem to stay sober, and was causing a lot of havoc in his family and the community, and he was about to be locked away for alcoholic insanity. And he came and told Bill, and when Bill saw him, Bill saw that he was sober, and he was amazed. He said, I could barely, even realize that I had ever known this guy before. Was kind of the sensation that Bill got. And he asked Ebby, what has happened to him? And he said, well, I've got religion. And right there, Bill wanted to part ways. Bill said, I tried religion and it didn't work, But the idea that Ebby gave Bill was that maybe you can just come up with your own conception of God, because the real motivating, or the real element here, the piece that really comes into play in a recovery program, is that the most important part is you just get to this idea where you can accept that maybe there is this power outside of me that can solve my problems, that can keep me from going back to drink. But the most important thing you have to realize is the power is not in yourself as an individual, that you've got to find power somewhere else. If it's in these 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, if it's in the power of the experience and the strength and the wisdom and the fellowship of the group of AA. And so Bill bought into this idea, okay, I don't have to consider another's conception of God. And Ebby also brought with him a series of actions. Ebby was a member of the Oxford Group, which was a group headed by Frank Buckman. It was a first century religious group at the time. They had a set of tenets and a plan of action that their members would take that was meant to bring about a spiritual awakening, if you will, and make you a better Christian and a better person altogether. And one of those elements of that program was that you must carry your message and testify to someone else. And that is why Ebby was at Bill's house that night. So Bill bought in, hook, line, and sinker. Of course he would. He was hopeless. He wanted to have something, and he saw it working in Ebby. So he began to do the things that Ebby told him to do. And lo and behold, he had stayed sober. And he started going back down to the Towns Hospital and working with drunks there. And even though none of them got got sober right away, Bill was able to stay sober. And so he realized, he came up with this thought in his mind that maybe only an alcoholic can help another alcoholic, because of the critical element of identification that melts away all that stuff that keeps us thinking that we're different. Make sure that will work for you, or if you knew how I felt, you would understand why I can't stay sober. And so Bill bought in. He was able to stay sober. A few months go by and he's doing okay, and he gets an opportunity to go out to Akron, Ohio for a business adventure. He's sitting in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel one night, and he hears the clinking of the ice in the glasses in the bar, and he starts to get a little nervous. And he goes over to the directory of churches in the lobby, and he starts going down this list of churches, and he pulls out a name, and he eventually gets a hold of somebody who's looking for a drunk to work with, right? He eventually gets hold of gets hooked up with a guy named Bob Smith, and he goes over to Bob's house. Bob had been trying to stay sober and couldn't do it. He had been a member of the Oxford Group, and it wasn't good enough. But when he came to Bob and shared his own experience with Bob and talked to Bob about the medical estimate that he had gotten from Dr. William Silkworth, Bob became interested, and Bob did the same things that Bill said he had done, and Bob stayed sober. And then they looked at each other, and they started to get this idea in their head, and eventually they went and began to share this message with other people, and they got another, AA number 3 got sober, and then 4 and 5 and 20 and 10 and 100. And what happened was they eventually founded Alcoholics Anonymous, which has saved millions of people. So I hope I've offered some clear insight into the life of an incredibly influential American. I've tried to cover briefly Wilson's early life, his progression into hopelessness, and the events which led to his recovery, and how he was able to use his own knowledge and experience to start a movement which continues to save the lives of millions of suffering alcoholics and addicts today through the 12 steps, myself included. And if there are any questions you may have about recovery, or any questions about Bill Wilson, or if you have a loved one that may be struggling and you want to know if maybe I can help them, I'm the program director of the Hale Foundation. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.